engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and of course you're listening to Z Talk Radio. It's Thursday, February 11th, 8 p.m. on the eastern side of the United States. And we're right around the corner from Valentine's Day, and in celebration of such a man-made holiday, I've brought the lovely Laura London, host of the incredible Speaking of Jung podcast. Laura stops by to converse about Carl Jung's exploration into occult topics like alchemy, UFOs, quantum physics, his childhood experiences with the occult, and of course his infamous dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomenon, in which Carl himself personally analyzed the seances of a 15-year-old medium. We have links up to Laura's social media information at our website, themindseyemedia.com. Carl Jung's occult life when we come back after the break. This is The Mind's Eye. Let's welcome to the show and give a big digital applause for Laura London, host of the thought-provoking podcast, Speaking of Jung. Laura, appreciate giving me a mind's eye moment.
Hi, Brian.
It's finally a pleasure to talk to you. We've been exchanging messages, and it's just it's a pleasure on my end to finally talk to you. And I can't wait for this show. It's going to be quite fascinating.
Well, thanks for your interest. I appreciate you inviting me on the show.
The pleasure is all mine. And like we just said before, that you are the host of a podcast called Speaking of Jung. I could say Jung, maybe you say Jung.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. When did you first get introduced to the thoughts of Carl Jung, and when did your love, I guess, of Carl Jung really begin?
Well, I'd have to say that I was first introduced to him when I was in college at the University of Washington in Seattle. It's a pretty liberal place, and they offered a class on transpersonal psychology, and I think that's when I first I had heard the name, and I was a psychology major, so I might have heard of him in some of my other classes, but that's when we got into him a little bit, and then I kind of, didn't pay much attention to him, and then in the early 90s, I decided to have a series of body work done. It's called Heller work. It's where we work on maybe blockages in the body where we're holding on to emotions or past trauma. And when that series was finished, I kind of wanted to continue exploring some of the things that had surfaced. And there was a woman in the same office that was, a therapist, and she was in a training program to become a Jungian analyst at the time, and I didn't know much about that, but I met her and I began seeing her once a week because I really wanted to explore some of the things that I wanted to take a closer look at, and she eventually became a Jungian analyst, and that's how really I was introduced to Jung, is through my sessions with her.
A Jungian analyst, that sounds, I guess, in a way self-explanatory, but what exactly does a Jungian analyst do?
Yeah, well, my podcast that you mentioned, Speaking of Jung, I decided to interview only Jungian analysts because they're kind of a rare breed. They're not, I wouldn't call them therapists. I'll just explain a little bit about how one becomes one. A postgraduate degree is required, so either a master's degree, an MD, or a PhD is required to enter a training program. Then, and I have this detailed more on my website, what is required, and I think basically it takes about 7 years on average once one starts the training before one is granted what's called a diploma in analytical psychology. So Jung's psychology is called analytical psychology, and he termed it that to differentiate it from Freud, which is psychoanalysis, and maybe we'll get into that later about their relationship. So the diploma in analytical psychology is actually equivalent to a PhD, and it requires what Freudians and Jungians both require of their practitioners is an analysis themselves. So every Jungian analyst has gone through their own analysis. And I think that in order to just enter the program AA program, one needs, I think it's 50 or 100 hours of personal analysis. And then while you're in training, you need an additional 300 hours of personal analysis. So it's a long process.
Well, it sounds like, to be a Jungian analyst, it sounds like you need two things. You need to go to school for a very long time, and then it sounds like you also need to do hours upon hours of self-exploration.
Because you need to know what's yours and what's your clients', and you need to separate that out. So.
And like anything else, and like everything else, or when we come with our own biases, so it sounds like that's a process of trying to be able to separate the biases that you have on yourself and not being able to put them on, I guess, on your patients and the people that...
Yeah, and I just would like to mention this one thing. I had just come across this, and I wish I had this before. When Jung split from Freud, Jung... the word that was used is that he reformulated the practice of psychotherapy. And I don't know if, I think this is common knowledge that Jung was a doctor, he was an MD, he was a psychiatrist, and what was said was that he no longer simply was concerned with the treatment of the sick, right? So when he developed Jungian analysis, after many, many years, it became, and this is a quote, a means of higher personality development for the healthy. And like I think I said in one of the episodes of my show, I didn't enter Jungian analysis because I was mentally ill or mentally unstable in any way. I just wanted to, understand why I was struggling with the things I was struggling with, why I was clashing with the outside world, why I would clash with some people. And I wanted to know what was me, what was them, and I wanted to understand myself better so that I wouldn't, constantly be blaming people, places, and things, blaming other people. Well, I wanted some sort of control over myself and what's my part in all this. And that's a piece of what Jungian analysis gave to me. I was in analysis for 17 years. It's a long process. I'm not saying that that's what's necessary for everybody, but another thing is, 17 years, but it doesn't stop. The process never ends. It's something that you kind of work on your whole life if you're interested in this.
I think for anyone, you should always be striving to be the better person or to be a better person than you were the day before. And it sounds like, from someone from an outsider perspective, that's I guess a big notion that's at least sounds like it's being incorporated into the Jungian analysis, is trying to be a better person, and the way to do that is through self-exploration constantly. Has it been a positive experience for you? I would imagine it has been.
Oh yeah, very positive. And I have always been interested in many other things as well, and I've dabbled in other things, and I've tried other things, and I think that that's what's given me the comfort in being able to bring this out into the world now and to talk about it publicly, because it's not that I found a Jungian analyst, all these years ago and just kind of locked into that and didn't explore anything else. I've explored a lot of other things, other kinds of therapy, medications, yoga, meditation, new age things, affirmations. I've been to lots of talks and lectures and workshops and seminars, and I even went once on a silent retreat where we didn't talk for 3 days, and it was a Vipassana meditation retreat. I've done a lot of different things, and I've always kind of come back to Jung because for me, he's made the most sense. And you had mentioned about, being a better person. And I think what Jung would have said was being who you really are, all of it, incorporating all of it and assimilating it. And I had just posted something on Twitter a couple days ago, and it got a huge response. There was a billboard that was put up here in the city of Chicago. It was actually near Wrigley Field. I think it was just for a month because those things are expensive, and it was done by a Jungian analyst. Her name is Judy Shaw, who lives here in Chicago. And it's just a simple black and white billboard, and it just says, "Be more human." And I was reading she did a short interview about, what does that mean? And it was actually in response to all the gun violence that had been going on. And she said that we need to accept our humanness, our vulnerability, our fragility, and that's something that we're kind of not. It just doesn't seem like a very popular thing to do, right?
Yeah, it definitely seems lacking.
What's that?
Well, I was going to say, it definitely seems lacking at the moment for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that if we would just accept that we are human, and we're not gods, and we're not perfect, and we can't be perfect, and we're never going to be perfect. We could strive to be ethical. I believe in that. We're human, and one of the things that Jungian analysis did for me is it taught me to accept my humanness.
Let's let the listeners kind of explore your website while we're talking a little bit. Give out your social media sites.
Okay, well, the website that I have, that I created just for the podcast, is called Speaking of Jung. So it's at Speaking of Jung, and Jung is JUNG.com. And there I have all of the episodes of the podcast they're available to listen to right there in the browser, or you can download them to your computer. It's free, and it's also available to access on iTunes and on Stitcher. So I'm on Twitter at Jungian Laura, so it's JUNGIANLAURA, and I tweet about the podcast, but what I love to do is, it helps keep me focused when I'm reading, is I like to tweet quotes from whatever it is I'm reading that day, and I'm always reading something Jungian. So I'm also on Facebook, Laura London, and that's a little hard to find, so there's a link to my Facebook account on the website.
Yeah, make it easy. And I really couldn't recommend your podcast more to the listener, quite frankly.
Oh, thank you.
And really, you just started. You're just getting your feet wet now into it, and
Yeah.
Quite frankly, I'm really jealous on how good it is, how high quality it is.
Well, you know what, Brian? You really helped me out in the beginning, because I contacted you. I don't know if you remember this. I love your theme music.
Oh, of course,
for the Mind's Eye. I mean, everybody, I'm sure, can relate to this. When you hear music that just touches you and moves you, and that's how I feel about your theme music. I love it. And I contacted you and I said, where did you get that, and how did you get that? And I actually was fortunate enough to come across a piece of music that, it doesn't touch me as deeply as yours does, I have to say.
Well, you can't
but
feel it.
It comes kind of close, and it's called Introspection.
That sounds like the most perfectly titled song for your show.
I know.
All right, so let's get into our main focus of the show, and of course that is talking about Carl Jung and his occult beliefs. But before we get into his later studies into the occult, let's build a nice foundation for our listener, just a little bit about Jung for our unfamiliar listener, and then we'll go into some of the more fascinating things that he studied. For those, Carl Jung is prolific. I want to say I'm a huge follower of Carl Jung, but obviously I'm familiar with him. I understand how prolific he was and how many disciplines he touched on: psychiatry, philosophy, anthropology, archaeology, just to really name a few of them. Within his concepts, there seems to be multiple schools of thought on his theories. First off, why is he so important? And do you think that Jung wanted his theories to be open to interpretation, or concrete, written in stone?
Wow. Well, Jung often said that he did not have the last word, because science goes on. And Jung wanted, first and foremost, to be considered a scientist. And there's some people out there, of course, that don't see him that way, because Jung was open to everything. He was open to the psyche as being a reality, and that psychic occurrences, he saw them as facts. Being open to interpretation, I think that he was I had just come across this, that at the end of his life, he was not happy. He was not happy at how much his work was misunderstood, about how much his work was misunderstood. And he, I'm a little torn about this, because on the one hand, Jung is very difficult to read. It's very intuitive writing, and it's just not my thing. I mean, I like facts. I like dry, just me personally, I like hard, dry facts. And when writing goes into on and flowery and detailed, and the sky and the sun and the flower, please just cut to the chase. Just give me the facts. And so I had read somewhere, and I just would like to say, I make an effort to only read books by people who either knew Jung or knew people who trained with Jung, Jung himself, or Jungian analysts. There's a general consensus that he was ahead of his time. 50 years, 100 years ahead of his time. And Edinger, one of the most famous Jungian analysts, he passed away in 1998. He was based in Los Angeles, Edward F. Edinger. He said, I'm paraphrasing, that we haven't even begun to understand what Jung really said. Most of Jung's writings haven't even been published yet. It's generally believed that only 20 to 40% of Jung's work has been published. I mean, he lived a long life. He was born in 1875, born in Switzerland, and he lived his whole life there. But he did travel a lot, and I hope we can get into that. He died in 1961. That's a long life. He started writing and publishing. I believe his first publication was his doctoral dissertation for his MD. That was published in 1902, and he wrote up until 10 days before his death.
Well, why do you think there's so much unpublished work for such a prolific writer? Is it because it wasn't in an organized manner? I know sometimes his family has been a bit protective, I guess, of his legacy and of his work. Why is there such a delay, or I guess not even a delay? Why is so much work unpublished at the moment?
First of all, a lot of his work, so not necessarily writings, but work, has not been transcribed yet. As a possibility, because he gave a lot of lectures. They have to be translated to be published in English, which is a huge task. So there's that. And then there is also the Jung family. His estate is run by his heirs, and they are very protective. And I don't blame them one bit for being protective, because Jung is very misunderstood. In our scientific, rationalistic, materialistic world, Jung is kind of a complex, complicated, when you kind of sort of contradictory. And Jung wrote a lot about paradox. Helps me to understand my humanness. And if I understand my humanness, I'm going to understand your humanness. And Jung, he embodied that. And
he understood it, and he, I think more importantly, he really embraced it too, for himself and for other people.
Yeah, he accepted it. And I was listening to an interview with Anila Yaffe, who was his secretary up until his death. She was Jewish, and she was living in East Germany and Hamburg. And when she was in school, in college, they pretty much kicked her out because she was Jewish. And so she went to Switzerland and continued her studies, and she started attending Jung's lectures at the ETH in Zurich, and she wanted to go into analysis with Jung. And from what I understand, he offered these people that were in exile, he offered them free analysis at the time. And so she became a student of his, and then she became an analyst herself, and then in her later years she was his secretary. And the reason why I mention her too is because the interview that Anila Yaffe gave to Suzanne Wagner in the Remembering Jung series, Anila said, he took me seriously. He took everything that we told him seriously. He didn't laugh at it. He treated her like an adult, and he took what she brought to him seriously. And I think that Jung's interest in the occult, he took all of it seriously. Seances that Jung attended, the ghost sightings, the hauntings, the premonitions he had, the dreams he had before somebody died, the visions that he had when he kind of had a near-death experience. He had a heart attack in 1944, and he had a near-death experience. And Jung was open to all of it. He didn't dismiss it. Jung wrote a book about flying saucers. He was fascinated by the subject of UFOs. Said that this is real. People are seeing something, but what it is, we don't know. So Jung, I just would like to say for the record, did not dismiss everything as a projection. It's coming from our own subconscious, that we're projecting into the outside world. That's not what he said. He took these things seriously.
I think probably a lot of paranormal investigators probably don't realize is how much of an influence Carl Jung has had on the community and the studies of paranormal. So there's a lot to talk about. Obviously the best place to start with is his influences and how he got into the occult. Carl Jung was exposed to spiritualism at a very young age. You mentioned the time that he was living. He was born in 1875. That was one of the large, as everything else, spiritualism goes in cycles, and that was at one of the largest peaks that spiritualism had into the 1920s, obviously because of all the wars that we were having at the time. There seems to be some correlation between that. But anyway, spiritualism is the belief that we can communicate with the spirits of the dead. So Jung was exposed to that belief at a young age by his mother and I guess her whole side of the family. Describe some of the childhood occult experiences that he had that would later obviously influence what he studied.
One of the things that struck me the most was, so his maternal grandfather, his mother's father, his name was Samuel. He had been married prior to his marriage to Jung's grandmother, Augusta. He kept an empty chair in his study where no one could sit because it was for the ghost of his first wife. So his first wife passed away, he got married again, had children, and what he would do was he trained 4 of his daughters, one of them was Jung's mother, to sit behind him when he sat in his study and wrote. His daughters were trained to sit behind him and swat away at the ghosts who tried to annoy him and scramble his thoughts. So that's Jung's mom. So she was used to this from an early age. He was attracted, supposedly, should I say allegedly, to Augusta, his second wife, because she had what was called at the time second sight. She had two personalities. She had memories of her past lives with these 2 monks. And she had the 2 personalities were like a good monk and a bad monk. Her husband, Jung's grandfather Samuel, actually researched her memories of the events that, when she talked about these past lives, and he actually confirmed them. And Jung knew about it. And some believe that and other things, lots of other things, influenced his investigation into the collective unconscious. How could she have known this? Is she really remembering past lives? Is reincarnation real? Nobody knows. And this was not the only instance of that. So I think Jung's most famous work in this area was, as I had mentioned earlier, his doctoral dissertation. What that was about was Jung was attending these seances. So this started for him when he was in college. And it was kind of the thing to do at the time. They called it table tilting, table turning.
Table turning is, I guess, it was really popular then for particularly fake mediums. They would show that was a way of communicating with the dead.
Right, but so Jung attended these seances as a participant sometimes and as an observer. And another interesting thing is that, so where were they held? One of the groups of seances that he attended was held in the apartment of a professor of art history at the ETH in Zurich. So this was not like in some alley somewhere in some gypsy's basement. This was a professor's apartment. This was respectable stuff. And
we're talking about his dissertation, obviously, and the name of it is just interesting. It really draws you in on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomenon. What was his thesis for it? That these exist, or is it a mental condition?
As with other things, and I think maybe this is why some people don't like Jung, is because Jung is not black and white. He's not either or. He's a both and. Up until his death, said that he didn't know who was speaking through. So who was speaking through her. Let me just give a little bit of background. This was his cousin, Heli, who he focused on for this dissertation. She was, I think she was like 15 and a half years old when she was doing these seances, and she would fall into a trance, and these imaginary characters would just start speaking through her. This was when Jung was at the Berg-Holzli Clinic, which was the mental institution in Zurich, was affiliated with the University of Zurich. It was kind of like his first job. And Jung worked for Eugen Bleuler, and Bleuler encouraged Jung to write about these experiments. He was interested, and psychiatry was really new back then. It was not well respected at all. And so that dissertation, if anybody's looking for it, it's published in volume 1 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, which volume 1 is called Psychiatric Studies. Jung doesn't come up with something at the end and say, this is all coming from her subconscious. This is fake. She's hysterical. He's not saying that. Some of what Heli said could be verified. Heli claimed that her sister was going to be giving birth to a deformed Negro child, and she lived really far away, the sister, I don't remember where, and that was confirmed later on, that she did give birth that day to a deformed Negro child. How could Heli have known that? And so Jung recognized that. How could Heli have known that? And I think that his work on the occult, and we need to define that word, because I think that word, probably not for your audience, but for some other people, are a little bit intimidated or afraid of that word. So I actually came across in my reading that occultism came to be called parapsychology, which now I don't think occult and parapsychology are the same thing. Kind of like the interactions between people and the external environment that kind of are not in line with the laws of physics, sort of transcend the laws of physics. Things like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition, mediums, reincarnation, out-of-body experiences, ghosts. And Jung sort of had all of those experiences. And why it's considered parapsychology or paranormal is sort of ridiculous to me, because a lot of people have these experiences. A lot of people don't talk about these experiences. But, I mean, if you did a survey of how many people have seen a ghost or believe in reincarnation or have had telepathic experiences, I consider that normal. Well, maybe that's just me.
I think that's what I respect most about Carl Jung, is that his willingness to look at these, I guess, so-called paranormal aspects of life. And,
yeah.
And I think what I respect most of him is that he was trying to bring it under a scientific umbrella.
Yeah.
Because I do moonlight, I think you know this, I do moonlight as a bit of a paranormal investigator. And I talk to a lot of people about Carl Jung. Like I said before, I'm not too crazy familiar, but I do think he's had a large influence on paranormal investigations today, and a lot of people probably don't even realize that.
You know, for instance, and his kids too, for instance, he had a retreat on the lake called Bowlingen. When they were excavating, when they started to build, one of his daughters started to scream that, wait a minute, hang on, there are corpses here. he's thought, oh my goodness, how does she know that? Well, they found a 7 foot, at 7 feet, they found the skeleton. And how could she have known that? And he said that he saw her power to sense those things as being inherited from her mother. And I just thought it was cool that when they found the skeleton, Jung did some investigation on, where it could have come from and how it could have wound up there, and he gave it a proper burial, and he, fired 3 shots in the air when they buried it, and I thought that was pretty cool. I just would like to say that Jung was an innovator. He was an outsider among the scholars and the scientists at the time, because he had different ideas. He, like I said before, he took these things seriously, and he didn't laugh at it or dismiss it.
Obviously, this is studying that at your dissertation as that a topic, looking into a medium to see if it's legitimate.
Right.
Obviously, I would imagine that. I mean, it would be controversial now, let alone controversial then. What did his scientific peers think about him, I guess, or really his topic of choice for a dissertation?
I really don't know the answer to that. That was 1902, and it was kind of a popular thing to do. It certainly, like you said, if it was done today, it would not be acceptable. But I don't know how his peers, I think they did not like it. I know that when he was in college and he was dabbling in this sort of thing, and he was trying to get he belonged to a fraternity, and he was trying to get some of his other fraternity brothers to attend the seances with him, and he said that it helped him weed out the people around him that had integrity and that didn't, because some of them, just kind of laughed at him, and he didn't not do it because of what it was doing to his reputation. He kept doing it anyway.
And that's the mark of a serious scientist, is that willingness and open to explore into realms.
Yeah, and I just want to also mention that, because I'd forgotten, that aside from seances, he also used a homemade Ouija board, just was experimenting with it. He wanted to experiment with the table tilting, so he got his mom and his aunts involved and his cousins, and, there's not a lot, I couldn't find a lot written about it. Then after Jung's father died, his mother and his sister, he had a younger sister, they had no means of income. They were kind of poor to begin with, and when the father died, they had no income. And one of Jung's mother's brothers, his uncle, kind of supported them, but they had to move, and they moved into this old house that used to be a mill, and it was on the train tracks, and that house was haunted, like legitimately haunted. And eventually the cousin Helly performed an exorcism on the house, and she said she knew who was haunting the house, and she believed she was given the power to exorcise the evil spirits, and she did. And Jung was really interested in the connection between spiritualism and psychiatry, and he had a lot of experiences that I believe provided the foundation for his work on synchronicity, which didn't come until much, much later in his life. But I believe we would not have that material without his dabbling into these things. It was as if it was all leading somewhere, and it was giving him the foundation to come up with his theory on synchronicity, which, we're not there yet. So
we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Did he believe that all the ghosts, UFOs, all these things existed, talking to the dead, or really was it just he was willing to open and explore it?
Yeah, from everything I've read, he believed it was real. And they had an incident at the house, their family home, which he married a woman that was, I read that she was the second wealthiest woman in Switzerland. And, like I had just mentioned, he grew up kind of poor, and he married Emma and inherited all of her money. And so they bought a piece of land, which I got to see during my trip to Zurich, on Lake Zurich, in a suburb I don't know if they call it a suburb, but it's a small town that's outside of Zurich called Küsnacht, and they built a house. And it's still in the Jung family today. His grandson lives there. Well, Jung had 5 children and lived in that house from, I think, 1909, and he died there, 1961. There was an incident where now this is a whole other story, had a colleague named Tony Wolfe, and she would come around a lot, and it was causing some tension in the family with his wife and his children, and his daughters, 2 of them shared a bedroom, claimed that at night something was pulling the blanket off of, she said, something's pulling the blanket off of me at night. And then her sister claimed that she was seeing a white figure walking through the room. During that same time, their doorbell would ring and there'd be nobody there, and to make sure it wasn't a prank, they would go outside and kind of stand there, and the doorbell would just ring frantically, and there was nobody there. So Jung said, the house is haunted, and this needs to stop. So he went into his study, he shut the door, and over the course of the next 3 nights, this work came out of him called the 7 Sermons to the Dead. After he completed that, all of that activity stopped.
What happened? What happened during those 3 days?
Jung felt that there was something that needed to be expressed, something in the unconscious that needed to come out. I can't explain this very well. I don't fully understand it, but he wrote 7 Sermons to the Dead, extremely difficult for me to understand that work. It's in the back of, I don't know if it's in the back of every copy of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. At first, they did not want it published, and he only shared it with some of his friends, just kind of like the Red Book. And it's written sort of like the Red Book, in that style. That's just another experience. It wasn't just when he was young and didn't know much and was naive.
Throughout his life, he almost had a constant barrage of these type of experiences that were unexplainable. Now, for you, when you visited this house, I'm assuming that there was no ringing of the doorbells unexplainably, or anyone touching you on the shoulder. I'm hoping.
Well, yeah, I actually did not get to go inside. I didn't want to. Some people do go up to the door and ring the bell. I wasn't going to do that. I saw the house from the outside. Yeah, it has these magnificent front doors, and I wrote a blog piece about it on my website, about my trip to Zurich and seeing the house. It's just this gorgeous house. But
how was your tour of, I guess we'll call it the Jung tour, visiting a lot of his spots? You did that pretty recently. How'd that go?
There was so much to it that I had a friend of mine interview me about it for my podcast. It's episode 11, and afterwards I realized there's so many things that I left out, but I did get to visit Einsiedeln, which is up in the mountains. It's the home of the Black Madonna statue in the big monastery, the big Benedictine monastery, and I did an episode of the podcast about the concept of the Black Madonna. I spoke with Jungian analyst Fred Gustafson about that, and I visited the publishing house of Diamond Verlag, which publishes a lot of books written by Jungian analysts, and was started by a Jungian analyst named Robert Hinshaw. So I got to have a private meeting with him, and then the next day I visited Küsnacht, and actually where I spent a lot of time was in the cemetery where Jung is buried, and I tell a really long story about that. Actually, I have video of that as well. To visit Jung's grave, and his whole family is buried in the same, it's not like in the same area, it's in one plot. So I couldn't find the gravestone, and I have pictures of it on my website. It's very old and it's hard to read. And
your trip there made your love of Jung so much more tangible, being able to touch the same things that he touched, to visit where he's currently resting right now. If you had to pick one topic to pick his brain on, what would it be?
Yeah, wow. I want to say, if I'm being honest, okay,
Oh, I
I
hope
want to
so.
say something about alchemy or synchronicity or, I don't know, something esoteric like that, but that's not true.
Ooh.
I'd have to say, if I could speak to him and ask him just about one thing, I would want to ask him about love, romantic love, relationships, why we love who we love. I'd like to get his thoughts on that because I don't know a lot about what he thought about that. I did tweet something the other day, sort of in preparation for Valentine's Day. It's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He said something like I'm going to mangle this, but basically he's been confronted with the mystery of love over and over and over again, and he still can't explain what it is.
That's,
So,
that's hauntingly beautiful, in a sense.
yeah.
Let's take a quick break for the moment. When we come back with Laura London, we're going to talk more on Carl Jung and the occult, where we're going to touch on his relationship with Freud, his last book, The Red Book. We'll be back in a mind's eye moment. We're back on the Mind's Eye with host of the incredible podcast, Speaking of Jung, Laura London. I'm enjoying this conversation. Let's jump right back into it. We're talking about Carl Jung and the occult, his beliefs, his experiences. We've already covered a lot, but there's still so much more to cover. It's going to be a fantastic second half of the show. For those who are familiar with Carl Jung, they know he had a relationship with Freud. And when you peer into this relationship, it seems complicated. Talk about his relationship with Freud, and then maybe even some of their discussions about the occult.
Jung started to read Freud, and he actually treated his first patient, Sabina Spielrein, based on Freud's work. And they didn't meet, I think, until about a year later. They were about a generation apart, 19, 20 years apart in age. And they came from very different intellectual backgrounds. Jung, Swiss German, and Protestant, blonde-haired boy, and Freud was Jewish and lived in Vienna, and they got along really well. And they had a very close bond, actually. Jung started to have different ideas. And Jung started to see things differently. And Freud didn't like that. Freud was a little bit dogmatic, and Freud wanted Jung to be his heir, to his psychology, not to his, not in a family sense, but to his work. Jung saw Freud as a teacher and kind of like a fatherly figure and a friend. And for a time, Jung made himself kind of the spokesperson of Freud's ideas. But then Jung eventually arrived, at his own conclusions, and Freud couldn't accept it. Jung realized that he would have to separate from Freud, and that was very difficult. I don't think people understand how difficult that was for both of them. I think that really that they saw the unconscious differently. Freud saw it as kind of a product of consciousness and kind of a garbage heap where stuff was just kind of stored, and Jung saw it as a creative source. And Jung also developed, his idea of the collective unconscious, that there are, things that are not personal, that are part of our psyches, that are more of a collective nature. And so the break between Jung and Freud happened when Jung published his work in a book that it has been retitled. It's now called Symbols of Transformation. So the break was kind of finalized in that year in 1914, and Jung's his Zurich Psychoanalytic Association broke from Freud's the International Psychoanalytic Association, and that's why, and when Jung formed his own branch, if you will, of psychology called analytical psychology. But Freud knew of Jung's interest in these parapsychological phenomena.
Because some historians try to make it seem as if that was one of the biggest things that did lead to the relationship breakdown. Do you think that was the major cause? What do you think? Was there a particular last straw in that relationship breakdown?
Well, I think the last straw was the book, because Jung came out publicly and published something that sort of flew in the face of Freud's theories. But as far as Jung's, what he called, in Jung's words, dabbling in spookery, right, in a letter to Freud, because a lot of the letters were published. There's a book called the Freud-Jung Letters. Was it part of it? I think, like with any breakup or the dissolution of any relationship, that it is obviously never one thing,
right? But
it's a culmination and an additive thing. And I think that was part of it. There's an incident that happened that Jung writes about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that's actually in the movie A Dangerous Method. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that movie.
I was going to ask you about it. What are your thoughts on it? Because I believe Michael Fassbender plays Carl Jung, if I'm correct?
Michael Fassbender and Viggo Mortensen. Yes. And Keira Knightley plays Sabina Spielrein. So it's the story of the three of them, Jung, Freud, Sabina Spielrein, who was Jung's first patient. And Brian, the movie is... it took me years before I could bring myself to watch the movie, and it was a few months ago, because somebody asked me to appear on their podcast about movies called No Totally, and there's a link to that on my website where we discussed the movie, and I liked the movie, I really did, but it was not based on fact. It was Cronenberg, and he has this thing with sadomasochistic sex, and he had to put that in the movie, and there is absolutely not one shred of evidence that, first of all, that Jung's relationship with Sabina Spielrein was sexual. But the sadomasochistic angle is total Cronenbergian fabrication. So, it made Jung look bad, the movie. It really did. But it was interesting to see, because there's not a lot of film footage of Jung, and there are some still photographs of Jung and Freud together, but there's certainly no movies of them together. So it was interesting to kind of see what the imagination, what you can only picture in your imagination of them interacting together. But there is a scene in the movie that depicts something that really did happen, that's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, about Jung is in Freud's study, and there's this crack that happens in the bookcase. It's a wooden bookcase, and there's just this sound, this loud cracking sound. And it happened when they were having a particularly tense conversation. And Jung said that it was a product of that. And Freud I don't think he liked that, he didn't agree with that. And Jung said, but these things need to be explored. The simultaneity of our intense conversation and this loud crack in the bookcase, that's the kind of stuff that does need to be explored, and Freud didn't want to. And that just reminds me of something that I forgot to mention when we were talking earlier, when you had asked me about these paranormal experiences that occurred early in Jung's life. And there were two really big ones, and they're mentioned in just about every biography of his that I read. And one is that when he was living with his mother and his sister in the old mill house, they had an old wooden dining table. It was 70 years old. It was made out of walnut, and it was round. And the three of them were home at the time, and they heard what sounded like a pistol go off. And it was a crack. This table cracked from the rim to past the center of the table. It just cracked. The account points out that it was a hot, muggy day. So it was not like it was wintertime and things were dry, and the wood just kind of eventually broke. There was that, and then shortly after that, there was an incident. Jung wasn't home at the time. He was a college student. When he got home, he found his mother and his sister, and I think another relative, just kind of all frazzled because they heard this really loud cracking sound again, but they couldn't figure out what it was. So eventually, Jung looked around, and he opened the sideboard in the dining room where back in those days you would keep bread. It was the bread knife. And I have a picture of it. I have it on the website. This knife snapped into 4 pieces, like a solid steel knife, bread knife, snapped in 4. And the thing is that they only heard one loud cracking sound. They didn't hear a bunch of popping. And Jung brought that knife. He kept that knife for the rest of his life. He brought that knife to a specialist, a cutlery place, and the expert there, the knife guy, he said that this can only be a result of foul play. So these were the kinds of things that happened. He noticed them, he took them seriously, and he wanted to investigate. Now, at the end of his life, he didn't come up with any final conclusions, and I'm glad he didn't, because we don't know. That's another thing that I like about Jung, is that he kept the question open, and he accepted the mystery of life, and that we'll probably never know. I used to think when I was younger that, by the time I die, by then I'll have all these answers. Well, I'm coming to the conclusion that I'm probably going to die and still not know. And I've got to be okay with that. We
have these fundamental questions that, if they would have been answered, they would have been answered already. Is there a God? For me, it sounds like I have at least a similar perspective with Jung, is that I'm open to it, and I'm not going to pretend like I know definitively. But at least I'm willing to explore the possibilities, whatever they may be. And this is he had so many experiences, and it seemed that they almost, in some ways, went even more full throttle after 1913, and that seems to be a bit of a delineation line for him. From my understanding is that from 1913 to 1916, he was doing work that would later become part of his final book, known as the Red Book, although I believe it goes under a different name, which I can't pronounce. I believe it's Latin of some sort. And Jung, he described it as trying to bring the whole of the psychic phenomena within, I guess, a scientific purview. That's what we were talking about before. And during this time, he was experiencing visions and hearing voices. It seemed like the Red Book led to that. What was the book like, and how did that affect his work, hearing these voices? Wow,
that is a huge, huge subject. I actually went to a 2-day seminar on the Red Book right after it was published. It was published in October of 2009. It's this gigantic book. The Red Book, Liber Novus, was his diary. And there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not Jung ever expected it to be published, and it wasn't published. He died in 1961. It was published in 2009. Some people, I've heard an analyst say that yes, he wanted it to be published, and I've heard others say no. But the Jung family of heirs agreed for it to be translated and published because it's got beautiful artwork in it. Jung was a fantastic artist. I think a lot of people don't know that. And this diary that he kept, he called it his confrontation with the unconscious. And it's extremely important, and all the Jungians were really excited about it being published because it is where all of his theories afterward came from. His encounter with his own unconscious. A lot of people have said that he was psychotic at the time. It was a nervous breakdown. That's one way of looking at it. I don't see it that way. I see it as an act of bravery, of honesty, of courage, that he went down. He went down that rabbit hole, his own personal rabbit hole. He went as far down as he possibly could, and he wasn't afraid of it. And he brought back with him all of this material that informed the rest of his life, the writings of the rest of his life, the teachings of the rest of his life, that to this day people are benefiting from. It's 2016, and here we are talking about him and that book.
And he described it, just to kind of support what you were saying, he described it, I believe, quote, that the years when he was pursuing this were the most important time of his life. And
Yes.
you can see why, because it led to so much of his thoughts and I guess what we call quote-unquote theories. But to doing so, it seemed like it could be dangerous what he was doing. He was almost playing with his mentality, his frame of mind. He was inducing what he would call hallucinations, or, I guess in his words, active imaginations.
Yeah, but I don't think that he had to dig really deep for it. I think that it was spontaneous. Correct me, guys out there listening, if I'm wrong.
But you know they will.
I think it was more spontaneous because he revisited a figure that he dreamt about in his childhood, which he named Philemon. This old man, I call it Mick Fleetwood. He looks just like Mick Fleetwood. He's got the long white beard, and he's kind of gaunt and tall and really skinny. But he had the horns of a bull, and he called this figure Philemon, and he figures very prominently in the Red Book. Yeah, I don't think that Jung was conjuring things up. I think they were coming up because of just kind of the great emotional turmoil he was in because of his break with Freud, and he was formulating his own theories, and they were huge and intense and filled with mythology and things that it was just so new, that he put all these things together. His theory of psychological types, or typology as it's called, introvert, extrovert, and the four functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, those came out of that time when he broke with Freud, and Alfred Adler was another figure that was in his life at that time, and he wanted to understand why they were clashing, and that's what led him to develop his theory of psychological types and the differences. And also what came out of the work in the Red Book was his theory on archetypes and the collective unconscious, and his process of individuation, which is the goal of Jungian analysis, is to find your wholeness, to find your opposite, and to become more whole. And when he reformulated, like I said in the beginning, his version of psychotherapy into Jungian analysis. But the active imagination, that, getting back to your question, active imagination is done consciously. It's kind of similar to a dream, but we tend to, for the most part, not have control over our dreams. We're asleep, and they're coming from the unconscious. And when we engage in the process of active imagination, we're awake and we're conscious, and we take these kind of fantasies and we move them forward, and we see where they want to go. And there's a lot of dialogue in the Red Book. He was dialoguing with these inner figures. And so in today's world, in the world of modern day psychiatry, we'd say you're hearing things, you're having hallucinations, you're hearing voices, you have a split personality. The psychiatry and some branches of psychology want to pathologize these things that Jung saw and that I see, because I've had my own experiences, as normal human experiences, behavior. And psychiatry wants to pathologize it and come up with a pill for it to stop it. So we've become a society that's medicating ourselves out of our own depths.
That's a topic for a whole nother show. I think it's, with active imagination, it reminds me almost. I remember as a kid, and some children get labeled, oh, this child has an active imagination, as if that's a negative thing. It has a negative connotation.
Right.
I wonder if there's some type of connection there, because some people did frown upon his process, the Red Book, and the use of active imagination, inducing hallucinations of. I wonder if there's a connection there.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I have practiced active imagination. I did it in a workshop, though. I was with an analyst.
Yeah, what was that like?
It was great. I remember it to this day, and I still have the notes, and some things came up that were unexpected. I kind of got to the bottom of something. I wouldn't call it, though, having a hallucination. See, there we go again, like using a word.
I know.
That has a really, well, we're so programmed, that has a really negative connotation to it.
Well, not for me. My past has dabbled a little bit here and there, so not for me, but continue.
Oh, cool. Yeah, but I mean, that's what we're saying. Are you having a hallucination? And you know what? I wish I'd have a hallucination. Maybe it's got something. Why is this figure showed up in my life? What does it have to say to me? Pay attention to it. Sit down, get quiet, and ask it, why have you come? What do you have to tell me? Don't, check yourself into Bellevue. But, I mean, obviously, if it disrupts your life, then, you might want to, as George Costanza would say, get that checked out. So, no, sorry, bad Seinfeld reference.
You're talking to the right person.
Okay, good. I mean, I use them every day, and sometimes people look at me, what are you talking about? Yeah, hallucinations. So, I don't know, that kind of thing, you said you, on the side, you dabble in this, and it doesn't scare you. It doesn't scare me, but I could see how it would scare other people. So this is not for everybody, but having a hallucination, I wouldn't call it that. I mean, I never sort of saw Jung's work as hallucinations. When you have an inner figure or a dream figure, and you decide to say, okay, well, what are you here to tell me? If you have a recurring dream, you kind of have the same dream over and over again, look into that. Do something with it. Explore it. Research it. Paint it. Draw it. Get into it. Try to figure out, why is it showing up in your life? So that's what he did with these inner figures, and he wanted to see what's in here. What do you have to what have you come here to tell me?
Almost let yourself go down the rabbit hole in a sense, but but with a rope, so you can climb yourself right back out of it.
Exactly. Tie one leg to a chair, right, and then just go down in there.
And just to clarify, my previous younger days is when I dabbled a little bit in hallucinations, psychotropic. So just to clarify, I'm a bit of
I didn't know that. Okay.
I'm a bit of a older guy nowadays. So these days, I won't do that. I won't do that. So, but in my experiences, although obviously it's a little bit different. One, you're kind of inducing in yourself. One's externally induced. I do believe that there are benefits of going down the rabbit hole mentally for a little bit, as long as you get yourself back out. Obviously, it sounds like you had some positive experiences as well. Connecting his dissertation, where he was studying the medium, and it seemed like he kept going back and forth whether it was hysteria or not, whether it was some type of a mental condition, and connecting that to his what we're talking about, the Red Book, where he was doing this active imaginations, inducing quote unquote hallucinations. Do you think he himself would do you think he would diagnose himself as suffering from hysteria, or what did he think was going on? Did he think there was any type of mental issues? Did he ever confront himself in that manner? Maybe this could be some type of issue mentally.
I don't know, actually. I don't know the answer to that, but he was not this well-behaved, urbane gentleman. He talked openly about his temper, and he'd have bouts of depression. I don't know if he knew what was going on at the time of the Red Book. He may have, but he came out of it. So I just want to say that the Red Book was kept. He shared bits of it with some of the people closest to him. And I had actually I wasn't surprised when it came out, because one of my favorite books about Jung is, it's called A Picture Book. It's got lots of pictures in it.
It sounds like that's more up my alley.
Yeah. It's called C.G. Jung, Word and Image. It's by Anila Yaffe, and it has, I think it's out of print now, but I actually got another copy on Amazon, another used copy, because I like to get the hardcover copies so I can tear out the pictures and use them for things. This was published, I have it right here, I think it was in the 70s. And there are images in C.G. Jung, Word and Image, of what's in the Red Book. So if you can't spring for, because I think a hard copy of the Red Book is like $150 on Amazon, there are some pictures of what's in there in this book. But where was I going with that? I forgot where I was going with that.
Where, maybe you were thinking about how eventually it was going to go, you knew it was going to be published, I think?
No, that he only showed it to, a few of his closest people, and just kind of, also, it doesn't end. He just kind of stopped working on it. I think the year was 1930. He just kind of stopped working on it, and so it's unfinished. But what he did was that he wrote in a leather-bound book. That's why it's called the Red Book, because it's a red leather book. On the paper is this really exquisite vellum, and there are these very faint lines, and it's written in calligraphy, Jung's hand, and the paintings in there they're incredible.
You mentioned that a lot of his most important work came from his time doing these active imaginations between 1913 and 1916, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. But just for a moment, with my guests and for myself, I always like to play devil's advocate, and you're a big believer and student of Carl Jung. What would be your biggest critique of his work?
Probably that his writing is so difficult, because I can't get it out of my head, that I think I said this earlier, that it might have been Anelia Yaffe said that he wrote that way, the way that he writes, on purpose, and I don't think I explained it fully, to sort of weed out the student that's not serious. That the people that didn't get it would just drop away. And so he wrote like that on purpose. And, I mentioned that I really love Twitter. Well, it's really hard to tweet Jung because I can't fit an idea into 140 characters. And that's why I think sometimes you see the same old quotes over and over again. I like the obscure stuff. He is very difficult to read, and his collected works, which are 20 volumes, right? Now, I have right here, the collected works of C.G. Jung. They're coming out with the complete collected works of C.G. Jung. They're adding things. So the collected works are 20 volumes. I have not read, I've read a small fraction of this, okay? So Volume 1 is Psychiatric Studies, Volume 2, Experimental Researches, and we didn't even cover how his early work on word association was the foundation for the modern-day lie detector test. Volume 10 is Civilization in Transition, and that contains his work on flying saucers, UFOs. He was very interested in that.
What were his thoughts on UFOs and extraterrestrials and aliens? Well, since he wrote a whole book on it, so what did he think?
It's good that we were talking about my criticism of him, because that book frustrates me. I can't even tell you how much that book frustrates me.
In what way? Why does it frustrate you?
Because it's like you just want him to say, this is what it is. I want an answer.
He doesn't give that from what it sounds.
No, he doesn't give an answer. He goes over this, and this one's dream, and that one's dream, and I don't know. Just this is why I'm not. You haven't asked me why did I decide nor not decide to become a Jungian analyst. I just can't. Just people's dreams and just all of this stuff. And he saw this, and oh my gosh, I can't handle it. I was not cut out for that.
Sometimes it's a bit too much even for you.
It's too much. It's too much. I just like I said, I just want the facts. I want the answers. But this book, it's called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. Supposedly, he became interested in flying saucers. They didn't call them UFOs back then. In 1946, and I find that interesting because the incident at Roswell, the alleged crash of the UFO and the recovery of bodies.
Yeah, he was alive at that time.
He was alive at that time, yeah, but the interesting part is that his interest in flying saucers began a year prior. And I don't know why. I find that very interesting because to me, the whole UFO thing started with Roswell, but that's not true. There were things seen and reports made and books written prior to 1947. So everything that I've read about Jung's investigation into this says that he amassed a library, that he read everything that had been written, that he could find and get his hands on that had been written about it. And his conclusion, if you want to call it that, is that, ladies and gentlemen, okay, he did conclude that they're real. Something is being seen. He's not saying that this is all a projection. He believed that something's being seen, but he doesn't know what. And he equated the flying saucer to the mandala, to the archetype of, because a flying saucer is round, and it reminded him of the mandala and wholeness. And I don't know if the cigar-shaped UFO is something that came later, but I couldn't find any reference to that. What would he say about that? He did think that, just like in alchemy, the alchemists projected their psyches into matter, that people were projecting their inner state into the skies, and that there was a need for wholeness. And he saw the world at that time, the late 40s after World War II and the early 50s, is we were fragmented, right? He said that the world is divided by an iron curtain, and that we would find compensation in this symbol of wholeness and unity, the round shape, which he saw as a mandala, as a symbol of wholeness. And he said that just like in ancient times the gods would come in our time of need, he saw this as possibly being... Now, wait, I just want to say, one does not preclude the other. So just because they're real doesn't mean that we're not projecting something onto them. I'm saying that he didn't see them as hallucinations, that we were thinking that we saw something. He believed that they were real. But an interesting part is that he was interviewed, by, I think it was the newspaper in Zurich, and he was misinterpreted as saying, because I had that caveat. He said that they are real, but we don't know what they are. So they picked up on the news wires, in America and in England, picked up on Jung saying flying saucers are real and used that as a headline. And Jung felt so strongly about it that he wrote a rebuttal to clarify, what he said. And they asked him some more questions. And what came out of that, why I mentioned that, is he said, people want to believe that they're real. And then when I said, wait a second, we don't know what they are, then he said, his line was, then the wire went dead. What he got from that is that people had a vested interest in UFOs being real. And here was a prominent figure, he was famous by that time, a psychologist, saying, hey, UFOs are real. And then he was like, wait a minute, because that was too definitive for him. He wanted to leave it open. We don't know what they are. And that was in 1958, so that was 3 years before his death. The article and the interview and the supplemental questions, and that's all in. Now, if anybody wants to read what he wrote, it is in volume 10 of the collected works, but you can also get the book individually. It's called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking with Laura London, host of Speaking of Jung podcast. We'll be right back. This is The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio.